Professor Martini?
Yes?
International tourism agents. We have a few questions for you about vocational tourism.
I knew this moment would come sooner or later. Please, do come in. Do sit down, gentlemen.
I apologize for disturbing you, sir, but you are our last hope.
And your first question is?
Oh yes, well, how and in what way did you start to notice this existence of this new kind of tourism, the vocational tourism?
It's been 2 decades since the very first vocational tourist made their appearance on the Adriatic coast. There's no exact moment from when this phenomenon started. It has been, as often occurs, a crawling process, slow and imperceptible at the beginning, then faster and more frenetic, which has shown us a new way of experiencing holiday time and has progressively transformed the way we think about and organize the tourist industry. This new kind of tourist was no different from the others. He was often the same as ever, but with a different attitude. If the traditional tourist saw the holiday as an occasion in which to suspend his encoded identity, for this kind of tourist, journey represented an opportunity to develop his interests and a new sense of membership. And through the filtering of his passions, the possibility of achieving a different identity from that socially assigned to him. The first example of these new tourists appeared in the 70s in the guise of those we used to call people of the night, who frequented the newborn discos with constancy and passion. These strange creatures had very little in common with the traditional tourist. First of all, they didn't belong to a touristic seasonality, but used to come here on the weekends throughout the year. Secondly, they didn't choose the Adriatic coast for its famous and conventional character, but for a specific pastime they could carry out here. They used to come to the seaside, but the sea was only a background to a very different activity. Over time, we noticed that a part of these new tourists was giving life to some new models of aggregation and some singular ways of using the territory. Auto-grill rendezvous, the pub as a waiting place, the discotheque crawl, the after hours at dawn, or the rite of eating donuts after the disco. They then went to bed, whilst normal tourists were about to begin a hard day of holidaymaking on the beach. And of course, we noticed that for many of them, Saturday night fever wasn't simply a hobby, but a concrete opportunity to express a new identity, far removed from the one assigned to them at school or in the workplace. For many decades, we faced a precise kind of client who chose his destination to correspond to his idea of evasion. Then we faced a new kind of passion consumer who claimed to need time to himself, qualitatively different from his norm, while at the same time having the necessity to express a universe of values as a definition of his own identity and as a tool in confronting other people. Nothing at all, however, was generating any visible modification in the system that produced tourism. It was only a simple switch, a trivial change of perspective that was nevertheless able to produce an epochal transformation in the tourist industry.
What does this new kind of tourist generate?
The Loisir Society...
I'm sorry.
The Loisir Society is a result of a recent and at the same time ancient history. A history that ultimately regards the revolution of our ideas of time and identity. For centuries, the identity, individual and social, of man and woman is moulded in the elaborate processes of experience construction that every community carried out in order to assert the main rules of communal life and the mechanism of its own self-perpetuation. In origin, in fact, those we call communities were actually territorial-based social constructions that, in order to be able to perform their task, had to rise to the rank of finished cultural systems, that is to say, able to arrange a whole range of values, beliefs, languages, rites, traditions, modus operandi, etc., such as to define the identity of the man that belonged to it and the principles of their belonging to the group. This process of construction was essentially based on a process of breaking down, which was divided between an insignificant time of everyday life and a time of holiday and the sacred. So, for this long period, identity was defined as the result of a gradual and continuous job of man's learning and acquisition, corresponding to a specular process of recognition by the rest of the community. The Industrial Revolution intervened to smash this formation and communal life model to assert itself as leader. Its protective horizon, in fact, had to, in turn, offer itself as a finished cultural system, or as a model, ideology, archetype of the entire society. Starting from the Industrial Revolution, a society emerged in which every structure, every pre-existing agency building, social process could do nothing, but I say absolutely nothing, but conform to the universal archetype of the factory. Thus, the town became the living factory, the school the learning factory, the hospital the health factory, the family the workforce factory. In the passage for the concrete dimension of pre-industrial universe to the abstract dimension of mass production, man's identity, therefore, could not be codified by his place in the workfield, his position in relation to the factory, and to the world of production. For this reason, after the Industrial Revolution, the non-work time could no longer correspond to holiday time, then consecrated to the building experience of rights just a few years before. It rather became the time of recreation, of man's production capacity, and later the vacation time, namely the suspension of the assigned social identity. For the post-industrial consumer, the non-work time thus becomes the object of an identity investment, the privileged, not to say exclusive, space of the interpersonal relations, a second large agency for building social processes. Only that, at this point in history, the traditional devices of experience construction no longer exist. The communities that originated them dissolved, if not in form, at least in substance. The experience of men is no longer something that forms through long and difficult processes of appropriation. It is instead something that is occasionally and randomly acquired on the shelves of an increasingly pervading and global identity supermarket, able to borrow and append every possible manifestation of the idea of experience up to here expressed in both the synchronic and diachronic sense.
But what determines the choice of one itinerary over another in the individual?
In the pre-industrial community, This group was represented by the territorial enclave of the community and the line of descent, family, ethnicity, etc., that originated from it, and in the industrial society by the factory universe. In post-industrial societies, this catalytic element is constituted by the passion. The event of the Loisir society can therefore also be interpreted as the constituting moment of an enormous market of passion and identities, in which experience plays the role of actuary element of units of measure of the post-industrial goods. A boundless but far from uniform market. A market that is unlikely to be interpreted through the traditional marketing tools, since its coordinates are no longer simply economic. As an expression of status or social demographic, with the old, young, women, men, rich, poor, but rather they are an expression of man that, by exercising their passions, express values, declare their affiliation. A market individualized as never before. If experience is built through a random acquisition process, it becomes nearly impossible to find two that are perfectly identifiable, but that at that same time becomes the arena that makes the development of new forms of communitary aggregation possible. The place where people sharing the same passions and reference values inevitably end up meeting each other, to identify with themselves, to create a new tribe.
How, therefore, does the tourist industry and his way of seeing tourism change?
In this context, the tourist actions are no longer realized in a suspended dimension of existence, but rather the opportunity to deepen this personal search for identity. It is not an isolated opportunity, but that, to the contrary, emerges as the well-determined fundamental junction of a consumption chain. And so, for example, a passionate wines and food gastronomy connoisseur will be unlikely to discover this particular vocation during the holidays. In all likelihood, he will cultivate this passion continuously through particular books, purchases, experiments at home, meeting or going out with other enthusiasts, etc., and might decide to use the holidays, and therefore the tourist action, to verify some aspect of this field of interest. So, in this case, it no longer makes sense to speak of holidaymaker, but of vocational tourist. A tourist that uses the holiday and in general his leisure time as an opportunity to express his specific interest or vocation, or to give some substance to an actual passion. In this way, the holiday becomes the expression of time that consciously or unconsciously he was assigned in the production field. But since the passions of people are theoretically unlimited, and they can regard the physical sphere of man as well as the spiritual, playful, cultural, etc. one, also the tourist products to this type of consumer have become unlimited. Also because, symmetrically, tourism ceases to exist as a distinct industry and becomes part of a production, consumption chain, or rather of an undefined series of chains that is brand new in a system of alliances that is no longer just horizontal, but that transversely cuts the single territory and the whole of territories. The development of a tourism such as wine and food shows that today it has become possible, or rather normal, to do tourism with a type of resource that only a few years ago we would have attributed to the agricultural and food industry, and certainly not to tourism. The chain that derives from it is, however, a peculiar chain, owing to the type of territorial tourism organization to which we are accustomed, and that envisages the entry into the field of new entrepreneurial subjects working as tourism professionals. The new tourist, therefore, no longer consumes destinations as such, but rather experiences, and these experiences, namely the whole of the cognizance, techniques, and emotions acquired, express the indicative figure of the new identity profile developed. From the offer point of view, we can therefore say that this tourist consumes the cultural systems which the territory is able to offer him in a finished form. To return to the previous example, when we as tourists set out along a wine trail, our interest is not dictated so much by the search for a particular bottle. That we can find more easily at the wine merchants at home, as by the gratification of the experience which that wine represents, and that involves its geographic environment, the cultural context in which it belongs, its production in history, the folklore that accompanies it, and so on and so on.
But with this transformation in mind, how can tourist marketing be redefined?
The transformation of the consumer paradigm that we have mentioned is the efficient cause of some of the main changes that the tourism industry has found itself having to face in recent years. The first of these changes concerns the movement of the industrial Bari Center from the accommodation axis to the attraction axis. In light of this rebalancing, tourism is becoming a project-orientated industry, or rather, the type of industry in which product conceptualization is decisive. Building the dream is still one of the decisive elements in the offer, but it must pit itself against a type of product and a competitive scenario that are much more complex. When a commercial item is created from identity exchange between territory and consumer, the tourist product becomes the territorial copy of one of a series of possible expressions of identity that are practically unlimited. The concept and definition of the tourist product has therefore changed. The tourist offer no longer comes simply from an asset in itself, but from the capacity to transform that specific asset into a tourism experience. At the same time, or we could say symmetrically, the range of potential tourism assets is rapidly increasing, no longer including only particularly vocational places, situations, or contexts, but also cultures, skills, people, and other things too. Many new types of community tourism are set up in one place rather than another simply because there are people or groups in that location who are considered to be representative and who can start up attraction devices that are of significant tourist efficacy. The governance models of touristic areas obviously at this point change. A substantially monocultural and relatively static industry has become multicultural and extremely dynamic in just a few short years. An industry in which, for the first time, the inclination towards innovation and the capacity to manage complexities are rewarded, and which, therefore, obliges all types and levels of operators to make a decisive change in pace and mentality. It is a market where inventing or reinventing a typical characterization is almost always, more profitable than copying something that is already successful. This task is also aided by the fact that there are several value axes that cross the imaginary consumer world, and that there are even more crossovers, finally, for each value axis. There is also an almost unlimited number of reference archetypes. This means that each competitor has the possibility, after carefully analyzing the assets that it possesses and the evolutions in demand, to define its own characteristic and personal marketing position.
What therefore are the new criteria of segmentation?
The vocational market segments differ greatly from the traditional models of geographic or socio-demographic articulation that we have used up to this point to define our marketing policies and correspond more to the concept of value sensitivity. Expressing one vocation rather than another means embracing a certain system of values that is represented in that particular vocation that become an expression and part of my identity. For this reason, segmenting vocations means, first of all, defining the group of values that these vocations intend to represent. Secondly, measuring the intensity with which the various subjects experience that particular vocation. In fact, all the market positioning decisions that will guide the formation of our tourist offer come from the original choice. It is clear that a high vocational intensity offer, i.e. a more specialized one, can guarantee a high rate of characterization to my proposal, but will obviously be aimed at a limited market. While a low intensity offer can be aimed at a broader target, but may run the risk of low characterization. Not necessarily, but it is a real risk. It is just as clear that in these cases there is no perfect choice defined beforehand. Instead, it all depends on the type of market to be addressed, large or small, emerging or already mature, saturated or relatively unpopulated, the resources available from the start and the operator's creativity, etc., etc. For example, if one wishes to attract opera music lovers on the condition that our rent offer is already sufficiently adequate for the existing public, it would be possible to create a sub-segmentation project linked to a particular type, for example, melodrama, or a specific composer. It would be possible to create a crossover operation between two different vocations, joining, for example, in the case of Gioacchino Rossini, the acknowledged musical quality of the composer with his well-known culinary talents. Alternatively, a generational crossover inviting young cutting-edge directors to invent a category that is often considered to be obsolete. As another alternative, upgrading operations, adding exhibitions, literary cafes, and alternative types of entertainment to the traditional festival in order to expand the initial group without disappointing the keenest fans among the public.
But how is the relationship between tourist resources, destination and products articulated?
As I already pointed out, The vocational tourist offer is the result of a combination process between the vocation of an area and the vocation of a group of consumers of various sizes. Each area's goal, therefore, will be to make its own offer seem characteristic and distinctive. In some ways, we may say, unavoidable in the eyes of the consumer, who increasingly takes care to make his own tourist attraction coincide with his own identity, and values models, but at the same time is also increasingly stimulated and distracted by a market that is becoming more competitive and dense with each day that passes. An area's tourist vocation is a dynamic rather than elastic structure. As we have already seen, this means that it is a structure that takes its ideas from some constant identity factors for that area, morphological, historical, etc., but which it can also decline according to the way in which demands evolves, and or is necessary to intercept a particular segment of the public. This vocation is therefore based on a series of pre-tourism elements, which I have called resources, that only assume the form of tourist experiences, products, product lines, after some suitable transformation work, and which bring about the so-called destination brand when they reach their final composition. What emerges is a hierarchical organization model for the product area that we have summarized. This is a diagram. What we would like to point out here are the competitive and cooperative dynamics that are created in this context, and which represent one of the main new elements offered by the tourism of vocational tourism that the former concern. First of all, it is necessary to consider the fact that in this context, competition between areas primarily takes place based on vocations, and only on a secondary basis on destinations or destination brands. A multi-vocation destination, such as Rimini, for example, competes with other seaside resorts in the beach segment, with business destinations in the trade fair and congress segment, and with entertainment districts in the nightlife discotheque segment, etc., etc. It may sometimes occur that this competitive need becomes cooperative, as the need to establish a certain type of offer precedes the one for competing for customers with similar areas. It may also occur that this cooperation is not limited to just the tourist context, but may also include forms of collaboration with all the producers of goods and services that regard the content of our offer with interest, being in the same vocation segment, and thus giving rise to basically unprecedented chains. The destination brand does not disappear, however. To the contrary, it increasingly appears as an umbrella brand that can sum up the individual vocational specification brands and create a common direction. That is to say, of establishing the territory's shared vision.
Well, what you're telling us is all very interesting, but how can this method be applied?
It's actually a very concrete structure that can easily be applied to existing tourist portfolio. It's no accident that these structures already exist. They can be defined. The field of operation for these structures is vast, as there are possible new markets with different rules from the traditional ones. It is therefore possible to modify the market profile of a tourist structure, a tour operator, or a destination, and the way in which the supply answers the demand. There is also the need to conceive and develop new tourist attractions that, born from the identity and resources of the specific territory, are able to make the difference by exploiting distinctive characteristics of a structure or destination. They can be individual structures or permanent territorial infrastructures, such as museums, rather than more ephemeral ones. It is no accident either that event strategy has become a fundamental element in the tourist industry, as an event can attract new influxes and exalt the image of the territory. The same can be said for holiday accommodation, that is no longer an accessory to a vacation, but has become a fundamental attraction in its own right. Hotels and restaurants have themselves become destinations, an integral part of the image of the territory, and should therefore fulfill this role. It has become necessary to construct a line of vocational products on a territorial level. A wine route, for example, is a tourist product that combines diverse assets: the landscape, the accommodation, a winery, a trattoria, etc., in a single itinerary, and at the same time tells the story of that territory. A predisposition towards the realization of such products can reflect greatly on the success of a destination, while at the same time unifying diverse brands under one territorial umbrella. But even more important, it is the clear definition of a tourist product and its functional surroundings. The tourist experience begins long before and lasts long after the time spent on the actual holiday. Therefore, the instruments used in the preparation of the tourist experience, the creation of the dream, the exchange of information between the various parties, the storytelling, the interaction between product and the consumer, the publicity, must be considered an integral part of the experience and developed accordingly. This last consideration is the most important, as it clearly shows the usefulness of vocational tourist experience engineering. That's about it.
I really don't know how to thank you, sir.
Brandy is always welcome at Christmas.
You can count on it. Thank you, Professor. Another case solved.